Have you ever wondered why Western leaders sometimes seem, well, hesitant when they're responding to acts of terror? Commentator Davis Hanson has this theory he calls the perfect storm, and in this explainer, we're going to unpack his argument, piece by piece.
At the heart of Hanson's whole analysis is this one central puzzle. When an attack happens, why do Western officials sometimes seem so reluctant to name the ideology behind it, especially when it looks like radical Islam? He argues this isn't some accident, but actually a symptom of something much, much deeper. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the specific responses that Hanson finds so, well, puzzling. Then we're going to dig into the three big causes he says are at the root of the problem: open borders, something he calls DEI ideology, and a general sense of Western decline. And finally, we'll see how he ties it all together in his perfect storm thesis.
To build his case, Hanson doesn't just start with some abstract theory. No, he points to a series of recent, real-world events where he sees a pattern of official reactions that, to him, just don't add up.
Okay, so his first example is a stabbing attack at Bondi Beach in Australia. In the immediate aftermath, before the attacker's motive was even clear, Hanson points out that some officials and commentators were quick to start talking about white extremism. He argues this was a really strange and revealing pivot, like a rush to a preferred narrative that had nothing to do with what actually happened. Next, he takes us over to Paris, where the huge annual Christmas market on the Champs-Élysées was just canceled. Now, according to Hanson, the reason they gave was fear of protests from radical Islamic groups. For him, this raises a pretty big question. Why would a traditional, majority culture event get preemptively shut down like that? And his third piece of evidence comes from a shooting near Brown University. Hanson highlights that authorities first named a white male as a person of interest, who, by the way, was quickly cleared. It was only later, he claims, that they very cautiously identified the actual suspect as potentially Palestinian. He sees this initial misdirection as a key part of the whole pattern.
Okay, so after laying out these examples, Hanson argues they're not just isolated incidents. He says they're all symptoms of a much bigger issue. And the very first ingredient in his perfect storm theory, he says, is a massive shift in how Western nations handle their borders, immigration, and assimilation.
So here's Hanson's argument on this. He says that large numbers of immigrants are arriving from societies with values he describes as antithetical to the West. And he argues that without successful integration, this can lead to what he calls enclaves of resistance. As an example, he points to foreign students on university campuses who are openly supporting Hamas as evidence of this major disconnect. But for Hanson, immigration is only one part of the story. He argues there's a second, really powerful force at play here, a specific ideological framework that he says has become dominant in Western institutions, which he labels diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Now, we need to be really clear about how Hanson is defining this term. In his analysis, DEI isn't just about, simple workplace sensitivity. He sees it as this rigid worldview that basically splits society into two warring camps, a permanent victim class and a victimizer class, where your membership is decided entirely by your ancestry and group identity. So this framework creates a really simple, powerful binary. On one side, you've got the group that's labeled the victimizer. That's typically the majority population who are seen as inherently oppressive because of their history. And on the other side, you've got the victim group, often minority populations who are then seen as deserving of special treatment or reparations, all based on their group identity, not their individual actions. And here's the absolute knockout punch of that worldview, according to Hanson. If a person who commits a crime belongs to a group that's been designated as a victim, this ideology creates a powerful, systemic reluctance to actually call them out. Why? Well, for fear of being labeled a bigot. And that, he argues, is the key to understanding that official hesitation we saw in those first few examples. All right, on to Hanson's third and final ingredient. He says this is the environment in which all of this is happening. He argues that both open borders and this DEI ideology are taking root because they're growing in the soil of a much broader phenomenon, something he calls Western decline.
And he defines this decline in really sweeping terms. You can see from his own words, he sees it as spiritual, emotional, psychological, sociological, and economic. Basically, a fundamental loss of civilizational confidence.
And he says, look, this isn't just some vague feeling in the air. He points to concrete symptoms. He cites things like plummeting birth rates, way below what's needed to even sustain a population. He points to energy policies he claims are self-sabotaging and to shrinking, under-recruited militaries. For Hanson, these aren't separate problems at all. They are all signs of a civilization that's lost its vitality and its belief in itself. So now we get to the absolute core of his argument. Hanson takes these three totally distinct forces, open borders, DEI ideology, and Western decline, and he weaves them together into a single, unified theory.
So here's how he says these three forces all work together. First, you've got open borders, bringing in populations that might not share the host country's values. Second, DEI ideology acts like a shield, making it taboo to criticize any actions coming from those groups. And third, this is all happening within a broader culture of decline, where society has just lost the confidence to defend its own traditions and laws.
And the end result of all these converging forces is what he calls the perfect storm. It's a kind of societal paralysis, an inability and maybe even an unwillingness to clearly name and confront a threat when it comes from a group that their reigning ideology has already labeled a victim.
So that's Victor Davis Hanson's perfect storm thesis. It's a pretty provocative argument, right? It connects immigration, ideology, and cultural confidence into one big narrative. And it leaves us with a really challenging final thought. If his diagnosis is even partly correct, what does it actually take for a society to regain the clarity and confidence to defend itself?